I'll just introduce myself. Then we'll take a little bit of a minute to sort of remember folks that are working on the fire or have trauma associated with fires. And then I'll introduce the panel members. They'll give a short presentation, couple slides each on to kind of frame the conversation. And then we'll open up for a larger panel discussion and questions from in the audience. So first, we'd like to acknowledge the incredible stress and trauma associated with wildfires for first responders and residents. The situation in 2020 is even further complicated by COVID-19. So before we begin, please join us for 1 minute of silence to reflect on the impact of fires that have had and continue to have on our communities, in particular, the loss of loved ones. All right, folks, thank you for that time. So my name is Marc Los Huertos. I'm a faculty member at Pomona College. Also one of 3 public members of the governor-appointed Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. And I'm pleased to act as the moderator for today's workshop. As I said, I will introduce each of the panel members. They will have a short presentation from each of them. As we move through the presentation, if questions come up, what I'll ask you to do is put your name in the chat if you can, and then we'll call on you if you have questions that are associated with each of the panel presentations. As questions come up, feel free to put your name in the chat as we go through. It sometimes helps to start the conversation and limit the crosstalk, but we can open it up as well as we get more interactive as the session goes. So first I want to introduce Cassy Aoyagi. Forgot to ask you how to pronounce her name, but I'm going to guess. Aoyagi. Aoyagi, is that correct?
Awesome.
Yeah, okay, so she's a board member of the U.S. Green Buildings Council of LA chapter, a member of the LA County Department of Regional Planning, Significant Ecological Area Technical Advisory Committee, and president of FormLA Landscaping. Ron Durban is a chief of the Forestry Division for LA County and Fire Department, Forestry Division. He's currently chief of forestry, 12-year member of the LA County Department of Regional Planning Environmental Review Board. And he's a professional, registered professional forester, master's degree in landscape architecture, business administration, and management leadership. And Richard Halsey is a writer, photographer, and director of the California Chaparral Institute, which is a nonprofit research and educational organization dedicated to the preservation of California's native chaparral ecosystems and supporting the creative spirit of inspired nature. So with that, we'll begin with a short presentation from the panel members.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Marc. I'd like you just for a moment to think about your favorite natural space, wherever it may be, the ocean, forested area, meadow, mountains, and just think about that place for a second and how you feel when you're there. I suspect it's pretty calming. And in starting this presentation, I just want to emphasize nature is our home. That's where we came from. And when we surround ourselves with things that belong in the space that we live, LA or San Francisco or wherever you are, it makes us feel better, and we don't exactly know why, but it does. And I'll give you an example. So I bought this piece of property where our home is now, and I took out all the non-native plants and got my chainsaw out and rearranged some things. And it's taken about 15 years, but this summer in particular, I have 2 pairs of wren tits, which is the classic chaparral bird species. It has a little bouncing ping pong ball kind of song. It kind of goes. It's the first thing you hear in the morning, and it's usually the last thing you hear at night in the chaparral. Anyway, I've got 2 mating pairs on my property, and when I go outside, I can feel my heart rate go down. I feel my killer T cell count go up, my immune system. I can feel my blood pressure go down. And you probably have the same feeling when you're out walking in your favorite space. But the reason I think my blood pressure goes down, maybe perhaps a little bit more than most people, is because I'm familiar with the wren tits and I know what they are and why they belong there, and I've got a background of understanding it. So when you know about your local environment and you connect with it, there's a feeling that you get out there that makes you understand this is the way the place used to be a million years ago. And not that there's anything wrong with rose bushes and petunias, but when you're surrounded by native plants that attract native animals in a native space, you don't know what's happening, but it actually extends your life. And there's a lot of wonderful things that we can do in our surrounding environments that do that. And that's the focus, I think, of the whole green movement, is to try to create environments around our homes that make us feel good. So nature is really our friend. Unfortunately now, with all the fires that happen and the destruction that's occurring in our communities, sometimes nature is seen as the enemy. And if we can just control that thing, we'll be fine. When in fact, really what the issue is, it's about our communities themselves rather than nature. And the photograph you see right here is part of a program that I sponsor, and it's trying to help people reconnect with nature. But in doing that, I sort of have a hidden agenda. When you can connect with nature, it's the only place you can go where you can be completely yourself. Nature doesn't care whether you're rich, beautiful, or variations thereof. It's everybody's equal. And so that sense of being outdoors in an equal space allows you to learn about yourself in ways nothing else can do. So that's sort of what's behind it all. But when we lose that connection and we think only of ourselves, Mark, if you can go to the next slide. We lose our sense of place, and we lose our homes and sometimes our lives. And so I want to emphasize that we've been out of nature for so long that we think we don't really need it. We take it for granted. And nature has a tendency to come back and bite us and let us remember that actually it does matter. So in terms of the fire environment, the message here on this screen is really the key point. If you want to protect our communities, what we've got to do is learn how to adapt to nature rather than pretending we can adapt, we can force nature to adapt to us. That's really essentially the main message here. And what you see here is a picture of 2 homes that burned in the Poinsettia fire several years ago in San Diego County. And all the bells and whistles that you keep being told what you need to do. They got all this defensible space, properly distributed shrubs. They even got a firewall there. Well, both houses burned, and they didn't burn from a fire front. They burned from members that landed on those flammable parts of the house that probably came from 500 feet or maybe a mile away. And so we've got to re-examine how we make our communities fire safe, from starting from the house, which is the flammable thing, to the wildland out, rather than from the wildland in. There's a lot of focus, well, almost all the focus now, is if we just clear the environment, our house will be safe. And then we found that's not necessarily so. So you got to make the house less flammable to be able to survive fires rather than pretending like, you know, we can stop the fires themselves.
Great. Thank you, Richard.
Sure.
Ron?
Yeah. Thank you again for having me. And I would echo Rick's ideas that we have to start from the house out. And my background is 23 years of fire prevention, primarily trying to execute the mission of the fire department, which is protecting life, property, and environment. And that's, for forestry, that's our primary focus, is environment, but we always serve this fire prevention role in the department. And there's this balance that Rick is trying to get to, right? There's this, we want to have a defensible space, and we want to have nature and an environment that supports habitat for wildlife, which is exactly what Rick is experiencing at his house. So the key is to understand exactly what he just said. We want to start from the house out. We want to work our way out into the landscape. And so there's a transition between that domestic landscape and a wildland landscape. And I think, when you look at this photo here, you sort of see what they've done. Some people would say this is kind of the donut concept, where you clear everything out a distance from your house, and then right next to your house, there you have all this vegetation. Well, it's basically the opposite of what we want to do. We want to be very careful about what happens next to our house. And then as we move away from it, we gradually get more and more of the nature, versus when you look at this photo, there's almost nothing in some cases. So if you go to the next photo, you can see what happened. This is the Corral Fire of 2007. So they've got all this defensible space that they cleared out, but it didn't help them, right? Because right next to their structure, they've got receptive fuels. And so when we go back to that photo again that Rick put up, house out, that's the message. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in the fire department. We're trying to convey that to the community. So they're really, really careful with what happens in that first 5 feet. What's now soon to be introduced, probably through some potential codes through CAL FIRE, where that first 5 feet is an ember resistant zone, and then we work our way out. And then gradually we get to, in LA County, out to 200 feet, where we're into a natural environment again. So that's really what we try to do in both in our brush clearance fire prevention programs, in our fuel modification, pre-planned defensible space programs, is that we focus on the house, just like Rick said, roofs and gutters, windows, siding, eaves, vents, decks, all of those things that are right next to the house, to make them as ember resistant as possible. And then that defensible space that allows our firefighters to get in there and defend the structure. So that's generally the message that everybody needs to understand. And we can work the environmental piece, the natural environment, into that system. So that's sort of the plan that we always push out with any community outreach that we do. So thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
So this one here, this is kind of a pretty good example. This is a national park system in the Santa Monica Mountains. It's one of their sites, and you can see that well, you can't even see the structure unless you look right kind of into the middle of it. The structure is behind it. So this is prior to doing any defensible space. You can see toyons and some grasses and probably some artemisia in there a little bit. And then the oak trees over the top. And I think when you see the next photo, you'll see some of the sycamores. So there you have it, right? So now you have a defensible structure. They've done the majority of the things that they need to do to harden the structure. And then they work their way out into the landscape. So limbing up trees, having separations of horizontal and vertical continuities, and allowing the natural environment to be there. I don't think they really planted too much more. They just took what they had and adapted to it. And that's exactly what Rick is talking about. We want to adapt to the environment so that we make it fire safe. And we still have this habitat that allows all the wildlife to be there. So that's one of the primary reasons why people move out to these natural environments. They want to experience wildlife, but if we modify it so much that the plants don't support that environment, then you sort of diminish what you already have for you. So this is a really good example of, and in fact, this is one of the structures that survived during the Woolsey fire. So it burned all the way through and around this structure, and it's still there. So yeah, this is not one of my slides. Maybe Cassy, I think she had something to say here.
Yeah, so Mark's my turn, I guess.
Yes, please.
Okay, sounds good. I'd say that my role here is to take what Rick is talking about, applying nature and the practicalities that Ron's talking about, and bringing it together into really smart landscape choices that minimize our fire risk. And as we know, and as Rick has mentioned, embers are our greatest risk. They fly in from miles away. And so if you want to go to the next slide, looking at our structure and what's around that 5 to 10 feet, even things we use every day, like doormats or umbrellas, even toys, we see this all the time. Things like that can be incredibly dangerous. And so finding a place to store those things in that first 5 to 10 feet. And then let's go to the next slide. And then once you've got the house and that defensible space right around the house safer, or minimizing your risk in those areas, now we can start to create the hierarchy using native foliage that is well spaced, not overplanted, which lowers your maintenance, which everybody worries about, lowers your watering, because if you're spacing your plants out conservatively, you won't have to overwater. You do add supplemental irrigation to your landscape because hydrated foliage burns more slowly than dry tinder. And you preserve and maintain your tree canopy, or if you're looking forward, you place your tree canopy incredibly strategically so they can be the soldiers that catch the embers around your landscape from finding a point of ignition. And one of the most important things is removing invasive plants, which can become fine fuels and move fire faster than we even want to imagine. And fine fuels come from a lot of the plants that we might see around LA and not even realize that they are those plants, like fountain grass, pennisetum grass, pampas grass, the wild mustards, the Mexican feather grasses, the pride of Madeiras, things that we can actually go out and buy at a nursery. But those are the things that further endanger our interface from a home to a wild space. And one of the last things is removing palms or keeping them very well maintained. Not only does this help minimize our risk, but it also provides a beautiful environment around us. It attracts, it creates, blurs the lines that nature is somewhere out there and that you can't have a piece of it. It helps the cycle of floods and slides because native plants hold the soil. Even after a burn, you're going to have a more stable slope if those plants are there and in place, and they'll come back faster to do their good work again, and they'll attract pollinators, which we need for food gardens and agriculture. It's really an upward spiral, and when you make the right decisions and have the hierarchy, a planned, deliberate hierarchy to help protect yourself, the problem solving is much broader than you might think. Even where Rick started and a panel we just finished, which is just simply the joy that you get from having this and the sense of security.
Great. Thank you very much. Each of you have really important and great perspectives. What I was struck with as you were talking, and I'll just ask this question for all of you guys to begin the conversation, is that you all come from this from really different perspectives, from a fire safety kind of perspective, from a native habitat kind of perspective, and then more of a sort of landscape design perspective. And I'm curious what you see as the major impediments for people in their own homes to be able to move this forward in a direction that you would call more fire resilient.
I guess I could start, Rick. Probably one of the biggest issues that we have is who's doing the maintenance. Once you have a design, who's doing the maintenance, right? Is it somebody that's skilled in the ability to recognize what should be there and what should not be there? Or is it somebody that's not skilled in that? You know, you might think of somebody that's just a custodian that, you know, I'm not skilled in it. I'm here just to clean things up, and they may remove things that you want to keep, right? Or they may keep things that you want removed. So the goal really is to make sure that we educate those folks that are going to do that maintenance work. That's key. And to make sure that if it's going to be the homeowner, that they also get the same message, and they're trying to find the right people to do the maintenance on their landscape. Because as soon as we plant it, right, it's just like an irrigation system. And Cassy can, I'm sure she can attest to this. As soon as you put that irrigation system in, it's good at that moment in time, right? But a week later, a month later, you know, a year later, then there's changes to the landscape, and now it's not functioning correctly anymore because you put in different parts and things aren't working the way that they're supposed to work, right? So it's not, and you might think of it as a collaborative effort of each part of that irrigation system. Well, if those parts are not in sync, then the system's not working well anymore. And so we want to make sure that as we go through our landscapes and do the maintenance, that we're always in sync, and that we understand the big picture and the plan. Why are we doing what we're doing? What's the purpose of what we're doing? And that's kind of the message that we have to get out to our homeowners and the landscape professionals that are doing this work. And particularly for the fire department's perspective, right? Again, I'm just going to reiterate it. This first 5 feet, super important, right? The next 30 feet is this high moisture content. It could be 30 to 50 feet, depending on where you are in the landscape. High moisture content type plants. And then you get to another zone that's maybe 50 to 100 feet. That's the shaded fuel break, where you're still removing fuels about 40% up to that point. And then you get from that 100 feet to 200 feet, where it's a natural environment, and all you're trying to do is to limit and minimize some of the fuel buildup, so that we get minimal ember cast, or a decreased ember cast that's going to come at the house as that burns, because it is going to burn. But you have to recognize it's going to burn. So you're gonna change continuities vertical and horizontally to make sure that. And one of the primary reasons we call it defensible space, right? Well, why is it defensible space? It talks about the people, who's going to be there. And so it's really important that the firefighters that come have that space to work in. And one of the things that's really, really important to understand is particularly in Santa Monica Mountains, it's a chaparral type environment. Many of the slopes are 30% or more in some cases. And when we get into our fire weather conditions that have 1 hour fuels that are in this 3% range, and 10-hour fuels that are in this 4% range, and we have 100 hours in our live fuel moistures, which we're kind of at this point right now, where we're about 70%. So when we start to get those kinds of things in a fuel model 4, and we look at what happens with wind as it progresses through that Santa Ana condition, October, November, which is when we have our worst fires, then we start to get flame lengths that are anywhere from 80 to 100 feet, right? So if we don't have enough defensible space, the firefighters can't be there. And all they're doing is trying to be defensive to protect the home, right? So if we don't have enough defensible space for them with flame lengths that are pushing onto the top of them, right, then they can't be there. They have to be completely defensive behind the homes or not be there in the first place. So that's the intent of this defensible space. And then how we build that is exactly what Rick is talking about, exactly what Cassy is talking about. How do we build that with the natural environment, with the plants that are already there, that should be there, that take less water, that provide the habitat. So all of those things are in the play as we're looking at defensible space and habitat and environment.
Mark, do you mind if I go next?
Please.
Okay. I think one of, the biggest barriers, because I work directly, with homeowners all over Los Angeles, is the misconception about what the chaparral or what a native plant is. What I hear is, native plants are explosive and dangerous. And when I take walks in the Angeles forest, as I mentioned earlier, what I see are leathery, hydrated, or leathery plants that hold their hydration all summer long versus the dry, fine fuels or even Mediterranean plants that aren't adapted to our summer dry heat. And these plants that I'm talking about that stay green year round have adapted for millions of years in our climate. And so, in my opinion, or what we know, is that these are the plants that you're not, taking cuttings with when you go camping to start a fire. You're really looking for the absolute driest thing that you can find to start a fire, because anything that's hydrated burns more slowly. And the thing that will stay hydrated is the thing that is the most adapted to our climate. And just sort of helping with those misconceptions about native plants and the education that Ron was talking about is a really good start. And I think that flipping the way we look at it around, so that we're not looking at, and I've talked to Ron about this, the word fire clearance. I think fuel modification is a better term, but I think, again, misconception, fire clearance, it puts something in your head that if you don't clear everything, you're completely vulnerable, which is exactly the opposite.
Right. And I would, I support that in a different way. We don't want to denude everything, right? We want to make sure that we balance the defensible space with erosion issues. And that's kind of what you're getting at. As soon as we have everything cleared, then we have massive erosion issues. And you'll see that, and we might even see it today if we get some thunderstorms here in the mountains, where the fire just happened, there's nothing there, and we're going to end up with potential mud and debris flow. So that's always an issue. And if we clear the landscape, it acts just like it got burned. So there's nothing there to hold the soil in place. The one thing, though, that is important to recognize is that when you're talking about native vegetation, chamise, buckwheat, artemisia, those types of plants that do tend to hold their moisture, they're the leathery ones that you're talking about. They're also high oil content. But as we start to get into the late summer and we get down to live fuel moistures that are below 80%, they start to burn and behave like they're dead in the landscape. And so it's at that point, October, November, until we get the rains, they're behaving just as a fuel with oil content. So we have to be careful on what we keep in the landscape in terms of natives. So we're really careful with, again, chamise and buckwheat, artemisia, and some of the sages. And so again, it's a blending of defensible space. We're not clearing everything out, but we're probably going to look at, especially in that first 100 feet, whether we have some of the sages or the buckwheat and the chamise, those high oil content, which is one of the dominant species that is in a chaparral environment. So it's a blend, and we're always trying to find that balance between nature and fire protection at the same time.
And I just want to clarify, I am talking about landscaped irrigated spaces.
Yeah.
I'm comparing a natural plant and how it survives with no irrigation to what can happen in a landscape where it's irrigated and maintained, just right. To clarify that.
So I think there's probably some work that needs to happen with, what happens when we start to irrigate native landscapes? How do they tolerate that? Can they take just a little bit of supplemental water to increase their live fuel moisture to make them so they don't act like they're dead when they burn? And that's kind of a big piece, and there's still a lot of work to be done on that. And whether they can tolerate certain things like toyon, perfect, right? It can take a little bit of summer water and increase its moisture content. So in that first 100 feet, that's kind of what we're looking for, because that changes fire behavior and it changes how the defensible space works.
Rick, what do you see as the major obstacles in this question?
Well, I'd like to come out a little broader in terms of examining this, and I think the final answer, the biggest impediment is us. And I don't mean us as people doing things. It's the way we interact with the world. Especially nowadays, it seems to be it's everybody else's fault. You react to certain things and it's because of the person you're talking to. It's not about you. And I think this is a reflection about our disconnection with nature. Ron, I don't remember the Cedar Fire in 2003, but there was a point at which the media had ramped up the blame so high against Cal Fire. They were throwing rocks at fire trucks down there in the southern part of the county because everybody was so mad at the firefighters because they hadn't saved the community. People are mad at nature because it burns and it burns my house. I think what needs to really fundamentally happen first in the conversation is we have to look in the mirror, to look inside and say, what is it about what I'm doing? Not about the Tanzania and the chemise and nature and the fire department, but what is it about what I'm doing that's preventing my home and my family from being safe? And really look inside. And that's where you start, from inside. And that means in terms of the landscape at the house. And so you get your house in order first, because no amount of defensible space, no amount of fire department budgetary expansions will save a home in these wind-driven fires. Because most of the time, there's not going to be an engine by your house. It's going to have to defend on its own, all by itself. And for the most part, as we learned in the Tubbs fire up in Santa Rosa, I mean, literally thousands of homes were ignited, including the fire department up there, burned to the ground because there weren't enough people. You can't have an engine at every house. And homes got to defend itself. Just like you, when you live in your life, you've got to develop a structure by which you can interact with the world so you realize you have control and other people don't. In other words, you're in nature. If you're going to be there, you're going to have to construct an environment that allows you to survive. And one of the messages that continually gets repeated over and over, because it's simple, is clearance and defensible space. And that defensible space, very important. But again, virtually all homes that ignite, as Ron said earlier, defensible space didn't matter. It was about the embers. And so people have taken 200, 300-year-old oak trees and cut them down because it's vegetation. When in fact, that tree could have been an ember sink or an ember catcher that would have prevented the embers from hitting the house and igniting it. So we've got to figure out how to re-examine the situation and dispense with some of the simple answers, look within and say, what's preventing me from keeping my house safe? And oftentimes it's paradigms and ideas that we've learned without really getting into the root of the matter. So I think the question here is being able to look within and then realize the environment you have chosen to exist in, and get educated and find out that you're not in charge. You're just a visitor, and you got to create an environment so you can continue to exist and enjoy the habitat you live in without destroying the very thing you bought your home potentially to enjoy.
Great, thank you. So we've got a few questions that I'm going to try to summarize and put in groups. First, I want to highlight that CAL FIRE has a app called Ready, Set, Go that's quite helpful in terms of providing a resource for people to think about what these zones of protection are. And it's a free download, and it's actually pretty good in terms of bringing you through a process of what a defensible space around your home looks like. Another comment is, the aesthetics of Southern California are super interesting. The palm trees, I think Cassy brought up, is really interesting. There's a great book called Trees of Paradise, if people have seen that, where they talk about the history of palms in Southern California, which is a mythology of what Los Angeles was trying to create for itself, but it's kind of a disaster in terms of both native plants. It's a crappy shade plant, by the way, and terrible for fires and rats. But anyway, a question came up around water and water use to maintain these habitats. And one suggestion was about using gray water to maintain hydration, minimum hydration, and the issue around drought and using water in the landscape. Cassy, have you thought a lot of much about sort of the water use issues in the WUI?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, generally, and I sort of stated this before, when you're using, you know, plants that have adapted to our climate over, you know, hundreds, millions of years, we're talking about what do we need to get them over a summer dormancy hump, potentially. The other thing I want to throw out there is that if your garden doesn't have sort of a sense of a year-round beauty, folks are not going to embrace that kind of garden. And for many, many years I've been doing this, native gardens have really gotten a bad rap because the idea was set it and forget it. And Ron sort of touched on that with the irrigation. And so I think what we get when we add irrigation, and we put in a subsurface delivery system around the home and within the hierarchy that we've been talking about. And what we find is with an efficient system, we save water. Using native plants, we save more water. Using plants that can handle summer water and not rot out, we have healthier plants. And if we bring a gray water system into that profile, that can complicate the simple goal that we're trying to accomplish, only because when we're saving water, usually comparing this to a non-traditional, to a more traditional landscape or turf. But when we bring a gray water system into it, we worry about people going on vacation and not providing the capacity to water. And now we have to have another system in place to provide the supplemental domestic feed into that system. And so if we're talking about, you know, this long, very long checklist of things that we're trying to do to minimize our risk, starting with the home and then moving out into the landscape, most homeowners have a list that they will never tackle. And so what we're trying to do is give them the most simple way to tackle that list. And in this case, certainly gray water is an option, but it can complicate the watering aspect of the strategy here.
Great, thank you. Rick, two questions that sort of are one part of my own history and then something you can sort of tack on. I remember Dick Van Dyke telling us to plant ice plants around our houses in the 70s and 80s, and that this was the way to protect your homes. And so there are probably a lot of myths running around that were probably embedded in a history of either popular culture and media, but then also kind of reframing that in a new way around climate change, and that, you know, we're going to be looking at hotter weather, more extreme weather. How do we plan for that if we're trying to reverse some of these ideals of what we should be planting around our homes?
That's a great question. And I think what comes to mind is what Jack Cohen always says. He's a very prominent fire scientist, retired now with the U.S. Forest Service, but he said that high intensity, devastating wildfires are inevitable. They're always going to happen. There's nothing we can do. That's my colleague, Cooper. Hey, quiet down. But the devastation of our communities is not inevitable. And I want to refocus that a little bit too by saying large, high-intensity fires are inevitable, but the destruction of the environment is not, in order to try to prevent that. So what you've got to do, again, is to look back at the house, because that's the thing that's flammable. And there's nothing we can do on the landscape to prevent the fires. And this is a major misconception. And you hear this from the White House all the way down. If you would just do X, Y, Z, you'd have this under control. We're always going to have these fires, but we don't have to keep losing homes and families, because every decade there's bigger and larger fires, greater loss of life and property, and more money expended on logging trees and clearing habitat. there's something wrong with this equation. It's not working. So what's got to happen is we've got to take our minds off of the wildland and think we can control that, and look at our communities and say, how can this community survive the next firestorm with embers that are coming from a mile away? And if that answer is properly addressed, and that means ember-resistant roofs, exterior sprinklers, for example, non-flammable materials around the house, climate change will not be as big of a risk to our homes and communities in terms of fire than it currently is. So that is really the primary focus that needs to be addressed.
Can I add to that? I 100% agree with you, Rick. The ownership of responsibility belongs with the property owner. They are the primary, right? And if they're not doing anything, the fire department is not going to be able to come and help them, right? They have to be the ones that set it up so that when we get there, it's defensible. We can put it out. The flaming front will move past the house, and then we can move on to the other structures and protect those as well. But the primary responsibility belongs to the homeowner. That has to be the message. And it has to be, like you said, it's the house out, and we work with the environment at the same time. So those kind of things are super important. And that extreme ownership piece, if they understand that they are the primary responsible party, if their house burns, it's probably because there's something that they didn't do that they should have done.
Yeah, Ron, I just want to accent that. Sometimes you hear these comments about, I don't understand why my house burned. It was, so random. And I mean, losing a home is a horrible thing. It's not something that, well, at least I made it out alive, for sure. I mean, that life is more important than any kind of material thing. But these fires are not particularly random. I mean, they ignite things that are flammable. That's really the bottom line. And so you want to keep things from being flammable. Yep. The structure again, and then what Cassy was saying, hydrated vegetation, you can't burn something unless you drive the water out of it, essentially. Right. So that's an important component too.
Right. So with our landscapes, again, just to kind of reiterate, it's about minimizing ember cast, providing defensible space, and make sure, when we talk about embers coming from a mile away, the ember itself is not harmful. It's the receptive fuel that it's going to end up landing on.
Yeah.
Right? So we have to look at the receptive fuel. It could, if it burns in a field somewhere else, we don't care, that's fine. But if it lands on your house and that part is receptive, or the landscape around it is receptive, that's going to push more embers at the structure, that's the concern. And everybody should be thinking about, well, how am I going to make sure that these embers are not going to get inside my house? How am I going to make sure that I'm going to have a firefighter come stand in front of my house and he's going to be safe? Right. So all of those things come into play to make sure that we end up in the end with a structure that's still there and a landscape that can bounce back.
And it just, if I can accent on that too, that's spot on. For example, a tree next to a house. People cut down trees and clear all the vegetation. And typically, if you've seen any pictures from all these recent fires, there'll be a house that's in embers and the trees all around the house are actually fine.
Yeah.
The house that ignites the trees, not the other way around. But the component here that's important is the litter and the stuff that comes off those trees and lands in the gutter and goes in the corner of the patio. That's the danger. So you have to keep your vegetation properly maintained and the litter, because all you got to do is go on vacation, forget about it for 2 weeks, and all of a sudden you've lost your home because you didn't rake the leaves out of the gutter. Gosh, I really didn't want to just say that. But remove all of the litter and then keep the trees from overhanging the roof and that kind of thing. But the trees are important to keep the embers from hitting your house. So if you clear all the vegetation and remove the trees, you've created basically a bowling alley for embers to target the home, and it creates a physical Venturi effect where actually embers increase in speed and number in cleared spaces. So you got to have that broken up continuity in there.
Right. Absolutely. Cassy, go ahead.
Oh, I was just, or even add onto your checklist to cover your gutters with a fine wire mesh. So, it's always about the simplicity and how can you do things so that you have less to maintain and less to do. So that's one of the many strategies, like covering attic vents and basement vents, but those gutters are a big deal. And if we can reduce that maintenance by covering them safely, then that's one less thing we have to deal with when we know we're threatened.
All right. One thing I just want to add, last piece for me really is the fire department is a resource for all of homeowners that, you know, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. If you called LA County Fire and said, hey, can you help me? We would have somebody come out and meet you on site and walk your property, look at the structure, and then look at the landscape and look at all the things that you can do. And you can prioritize those things. And then, like you said, you may not get all of them done, but we can prioritize them for you so that you at least have a plan. So that's available to anybody in the LA County.
Yeah, I'd love to have all the other municipalities take your model because that doesn't happen very often.
Right.
Yeah, and another thing I've seen success with, some elements of success, and it has more benefits than just making the community more Firewise, but having a fire safe council within a community. Yeah. It does more than just, you know, we always know with mosquitoes, fire, all of these things, we're only as good as our neighbors. But when we bring the entire neighborhood and create a hub of resilience, we're not just protecting ourselves or reducing, minimizing risk from fire, we're creating an entire resilience hub in our community. We suddenly know what our resources are, who's a doctor, who's a nurse, who are our elderly, and those are the communities that come back stronger and stay safer.
You know, the Fire Safe Council in California has got it pretty well together. Unfortunately, all the money in those grants that they get is for vegetation clearance. Ron, you might want to correct me, but I have yet to find a grant that's actually been used, publicly available, and here it is, to actually retrofit structures and that kind of thing. They've done that in Idlewild, they've done it in Big Bear, but it was an independent thing through FEMA. So a part of the local Fire Safe Council, when they start applying for grants and they don't see any to retrofit vents, they pick up the phone and call the representative. It's, why is it all about vegetation when my house just burned down and they did the right thing? So there's got to be some political pressure there to get the politicians to really listen to what's actually causing homes to burn rather than what they think causes it.
Rick, there's a political problem there. You can't use public money on private people's homes.
Right.
But you know, actually, they use $1 public money from FEMA to correct the problems in Big Bear and Idlewild.
Yeah, but that's not Firewise money, right?
I know that, but that's where somebody's got to change the law. You know what I mean? I mean,
it would be a serious social justice issue to be funneling money to people living in the hills to retrofit their house and not other people. So I get what you're saying, but it can't come through that mechanism.
Well, okay, I got to disagree because there's a lot of mobile home parks with a lot of lower income people, a lot of diverse communities that were destroyed in the Paradise situation up there with the campfire. And one of the things this money could go to is retrofitting those trailer parks with a community-wide fire-safe extinguishing system where there's a water tank that's got spray going all over the community. I mean, there's ways that we can allocate money because right now we're spending billions of dollars and people are dying, and we've got to think differently, you know? And I get your point. I don't want to spend $1 million to retrofit the houses in Malibu, right? But there's ways we can allocate public money to help communities of lower income too.
Folks that are for ways to use those grants in local fire safety, I've seen them used to get rid of Pennisedum grass that's coming up to people's doorsteps, and I've seen them used to put in fire tanks, water tanks, I'm sorry. So I have seen them used productively in community areas as well, but for sure, all of these types of grants need to be tracked and used in the most productive way.
I'm glad we got to go back and forth on something. That's fun. One of the questions I think came up that Ron brought up, and Cassy, maybe you can address this, is that, you know, who's doing the maintenance and the issues around there? There's not, as far as I know, there's no certification process for gardeners that are fire trained by CAL FIRE or by the Department of the Fire Department, right? So we're kind of a little bit of a gap here in terms of competency and expertise of how you find that that capacity. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I definitely think that we need to move gardening from less of a yard janitor task to more of a fine pruning, irrigation check, dead material. And that is absolutely critical. But I also think that some of that starts from the planning. You know, I think designers have big eyes and their designs are much more about them than the actual site and the long-term maintenance of that residence. And so I think that a lot of it is in the planning, a lot of it is in homeowner education from the planner, and then having the right people. And I will take this opportunity to mention that USGBC-LA, the organization that has put on MGBCE, CNPS, the California Native Plant Society, and the Theodore Payne Foundation received a grant, and they're all working together on a pilot program for gardener certification. And part of that gardener certification is going to be training gardeners that are gardeners, but more like yard janitors, but to train them to have all of the skills when it comes to taking care of native plants. And certainly there needs to be a Firewise checklist within that program. It's in its pilot stage. I'm involved in it, and certainly we'll develop that in a way so that we can keep the good work that's going after the landscape's planted.
All right, Cassy, we would love to join you in that. If you have opportunities for the fire department to collaborate on this, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have, I think we have 5 more minutes. Is that right? Did we end at like 5 of?
It's over.
Oh, that's so we were supposed to end at 45.
11:50, I believe.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me just take this time then to thank everybody. I really appreciate the conversation. And I think that all 3 of the panel members would be glad to follow up with people with individual questions that are that you might still have unanswered. If you have issues, concerns around forestry and fire protection in California, I am the public board member, so you may contact me on that as well. And thank you so much for attending, and have a good rest of your conference.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Cassy and Mark. Mm-hmm.